Hey, PerfBytes listeners, before you get started with today's episode, please pay attention to this message from our sponsor, SmartBear.
Whether you want to load test your APIs or your browser-based applications, you need to be able to easily scale up volume and identify problem areas. SmartBear has you covered. Load UI is the rockstar of API load testing. Using an intuitive, versatile design, Load UI gives you the power to scale up and out, letting you dial up high volume and real-world load from any number of local and remote computers, all within a single test environment. With Load UI, it's easy to create and configure tests incorporating all of your OS, application, and database statistics agentlessly. It's fully interactive too, so you can easily modify your test and fix errors on the fly. Load Complete is an astonishingly easy-to-use load testing tool for HTML, AJAX, and rich internet applications. Create and run automated load tests in minutes using a browser to naturally record your interactions with your website or app. You can scale up the number of virtual users, pull in data from Excel and other sources, monitor server resources during test execution, and even distribute your tests geographically. Reports and charts make it a breeze to explore aspects of how your site or app performs under pressure and ultimately pinpoint performance issues proactively. Load UI and Load Complete by SmartBear. Ensure outstanding performance across your entire web stack.
It's time for PerfBytes.
What the is PerfBytes? The fourth square meal of the day. Don't bogart the PerfBytes. Waffles. Microwave ready. Blah, blah, blah. Add nutritional value to your brain.
It's time for PerfBytes with your hosts Mark Tomlinson, James Pulley, and Howard Chorney.
PerfBytes.
Whatever.
Hey, it's time for PerfBytes. Hello, PerfByters. Welcome to another wonderful episode, or maybe an episode, maybe not an episode. Maybe it's in between. You know, I was listening to Andy Tinkham's Testing Bias podcast recently. He's just taking off. They've done like 8 episodes, and they talked about nuance. Nuance. What do you guys think about nuance?
Nuance. It seems very.
Well, I'm not sure what it means. It could mean.
Well, I mean, as a writer, you know, something that's very nuanced is very subtle and potentially intriguing.
Yeah.
It seems like testing would be much more of a finite item unless you're using nuance to talk about edge conditions or something of that nature.
It sounds like the name of a new test tool.
Nuance. Yeah, maybe we'd build a new.
From Nuance.
Nuance brings you Shape Runner, Quality Runner from Nuance. Good.
And if you find quality in your product, it really is a nuance.
It is a nuance, or it could be aesthetic quality. So
or maybe it's a body wash.
It could be a body wash. But anyway, Ian and Andy do a nice job of talking about nuance on the Testing Bias, testingbias.com. Check out the podcast, PerfByters. So shout out to our good friends. And James, Howard, how are you guys? James, you know, we missed Howard last time on the last episode. So, Howard, how are you doing? We missed you.
I know, and I miss being with you guys too. Whoever my client needed me, so I was there working diligently to ensure that they had a very successful pay-per-view event on Saturday, May 2nd, and they absolutely did. So you've read horror stories on other providers,
yes,
not having such a good time. The provider I was working for was definitely not a candidate for news of the dance.
They were angelically supported amongst the clouds, quite physically in the cloud, right?
Exactly, they were. So that's why I wasn't here. I was there, but.
Very good. Well, welcome back.
My client's happiness made it all worthwhile.
That's wonderful. That's
good.
That's right. And James, how are things at the Southern Command?
I got to tell you, the pollen has shifted, and up until yesterday, I was suffering horribly from allergies, and I seemed to conquer them today. So what did I do? I went out and mowed the grass.
Well, that's good. Are you on any medications over the counter or otherwise?
I should be for mowing the grass right after coming out of a high pollen season, but that's a separate story.
Living the edge.
I am Claritin Clear.
That's good.
I read an article today, and it actually said we are here in the Northeast are in a pollen tsunami.
Pollenami.
A pollenami, because all the grass, because of all the water and everything, the grass and the tree pollens decided to all let go at once.
That sounds really good.
So it was like the double whammy of pollen exposure.
I will say my remedy more than anything, I do the Benadryl at night, a 12-hour Benadryl, because it makes you drowsy and might as well sleep. And you don't want to operate heavy equipment while you're on the Benadryl. And then I do the 12-hour Claritin during the day, so Claritin doesn't make you as drowsy. So, I actually change it up, a 1-2 punch like that. And
so do you stay Claritin clear throughout the day?
You could say that, yeah. And then I'm Benadryl unconscious for the rest of the night.
Wow, that's a nice combination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate where I do not suffer from allergies to tree or grass pollen.
You're lucky. Speaking of being lucky and pollen unaffected without allergies, we actually had a submission on ask@perfbytes.com, another one in the inbox for ask@perfbytes.com. James, you want to tell us about this?
We have an email from Vasu who's experiencing a pretty common issue. So he's going through multiple rounds of performance tests, and in his environment, he happens to be Oracle application based, but it's pretty common. It happens across all protocols and all tools. So every time the load test results are showing different response times, especially in the 90th percentile and the average, and they're unable really to compare test results from multiple runs. They've looked at a couple of monitoring metrics, CPU, memory, and a few others, but they're still not able to isolate what is the root cause here. And if you look across various forums on the internet, from Google to Yahoo to Facebook to LinkedIn, this is a very common question. My test doesn't reproduce.
Doesn't reproduce what?
Yeah.
All the time? Or is it a... is it an outlier? I guess one of my questions is, and I'm already jumping the gun today, is it an outlier, or is this just consistent from run to run?
You see, there's the problem, Howard. It's inconsistent.
It's consistently inconsistent.
Yeah, so you can't get any 2 or 3 that line up from a consistency basis. And I've seen a couple of reasons of why this occurs. And it usually boils down to a couple of different items. It's either initial conditions are changing, or in-test conditions are changing from test to test. Now, those are 2 very broad categories that we'll break down here in just a moment. But going back to kind of the test 101, where you're looking at, hey, what do I do to get a consistent, repeatable test? The very first thing that comes up is this concept of initial conditions.
Yeah.
Documenting them, rolling back to them, and maintaining them. And what is coming more of an issue, particularly with virtualized environments these days, is in-test conditions.
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of seed those 2 ideas to you 2 guys on the initial and the in-test, and let's kind of go through it and see what our thoughts are there.
So, my first questions, and I do know that James, you explained that, and they were looking at CPU and memory and things like that from a monitoring perspective. But, what else were they looking at? There's a lot more going on in testing life than just CPU and memory and such.
Yeah, you remember the other I/O things, right? Network, disk, and those are just the physical things to monitor.
So that's kind of where I was going with that, Mark. I was just wondering, what is the environment like? How controlled are they in the environment? And what other monitoring tools are they looking at to use when they're getting this inconsistency? Another thing, as we've all talked about before, as wonderful as virtualized environments are and can be, they can also cause, they're very cost effective, but they can also cause other issues, especially if these virtualized environments are sharing the same. How many virtualized environments are sitting in the same box, right?
Yep.
So what's happening there?
And you can just imagine if vMotion picks up and moves portions of your test infrastructure during the test, or if you have someone downloading the latest version of the Java SDK, in the middle of your test, all of that can just kind of blow things wide open.
Another thing I was thinking of too, James, is, all right, so you're looking at CPU and memory and everything on your systems under test. Were you looking at what was happening to your physical load generator? Because I think they were using Load Runner.
Yep.
So do they actually know what was happening on their load generator or controller? Were those set up in virtualized environments? Were there actually issues occurring with that part of the infrastructure? Because Lord knows I've never seen an issue with that before.
And I always like to take a look at the global data set to see if there's any piece of it which is consistent. So if I were to filter out everything except for one particular load generator, would that load generator be consistent, but other load generators would not be consistent?
Right.
That would say, hey, we have an overloaded load generator problem here. That's a problem if you only have one load generator. You don't have a control set then that you can look at. Similarly, is it all business processes or all business functions? Is login consistent, but add something to the cart is inconsistent, as an example?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great that's a great point too. And another thing I was thinking of is, and this does make a difference, are you working in a large IT shop or a smaller engineering/IT shop? Because honestly, you get, I think if you're in a smaller shop, you'll get much better control of your environment. Where if you're in a larger shop, there's so many things that could be happening in that test environment while you're running the test. And I'd also like to understand what the duration, if he was testing and getting inconsistent results throughout the test. I'm just curious what the duration they were running. Was it like over the course of a month, they test every day? They do multiple test runs every day? There should be enough logs and data to understand what's going on with that.
Yeah, I was just going to say this, not to pick on Vasu, because Vasu is, as you point out, James, indicative of so many struggles and challenges that testers, particularly performance testers, have nowadays. And I think it's, not to be blunt, but it's people who stopped trying to be smart about what they're doing with computers, particularly when you have performance testers like Vasu who know what a CPU is, obviously knows how to do some monitoring. Maybe he's had some basic load runner training, but he's in an environment that, from my standpoint, whoever configured his system, they don't understand what it means to take a performance measure. They don't understand controlling for test conditions. And if Vasu is suffering in a performance sense, to be honest, if there's a whole slew of functional or even manual functional testers on the same team that are equally stepping on one another's data sets, stepping on one another's resources in a huge, messy, chaotic act of stupidity in shared environments to save money, well, guess what? All of your test results, all of that money you spent on testing, you might as well just throw it away because you're just being stupid from the get-go.
So Mark, I want to share with you an example from an actual client. They had developers that were running ad hoc queries in the test environment during tests and destroying the integrity of tests because they were told they couldn't run ad hoc queries in production.
Yeah. And this is where I think probably the biggest culprit, and the sad thing is that somebody that's maybe capable like Vasu or any other test engineer, they end up they become the victim because we're the least empowered engineers in the whole IT department. No one listens to QA. And they just walk all over you when you say, hey, I think these measurements are wrong. And they're like, what could you possibly know? You're just an external contractor tester. We're just going to dismiss you. I'm a VMware administrator. I know how to build shared infrastructures and everything's managed and blah, blah. And obviously, I've talked to those guys. They don't know what they're doing. It's really ridiculous. So I feel bad for Vasu, but let's try to break this apart a little bit and kind of get into some things that might help Vasu. And the first one I'll throw out there, if you are in a shared environment, keep in mind that not all bottlenecks are physical. So he mentioned CPU and memory, and Howard, you just also talked about other things, network and disk I/O. There are other kinds of what I would call logical bottlenecks that might be being consumed in this chaotic shared environment that makes the test not reproducible. One of the two that come to mind is the number of connections. So let's say you have, maybe he's doing load testing in the same environment as other people doing integration or other QA testing or development or these ad hoc queries that you say, James. those other queries might be random and have random access. So suddenly they're chewing up 3 or 4 connections in the pool. So your test suddenly seems slower because there's some queuing going on. But really, there's a huge database and you can't really detect it from CPU, disk, and memory because your traffic's not getting there.
So do you think if they were using, so Mark, if you think they're using something like AppD or Dynatrace or something like that, they could really start to monitor those connections, though, while they're doing the test? If they do it on the actual physical machines that they know are under test, they should be able to see things like that happening, right?
Yeah, I can imagine like any good diagnostic tool that opens up the code, you can start seeing those metrics. But even Vasu, maybe if he had the capability with his tool, with LoadRunner, hey, I'm going to do a couple of direct ODBC queries into the database from LoadRunner. At the same time, I'm running the middle tier web service test. At the same time, I'm running some end-to-end web tests. And you could even just take those measurements from a virtual user to see, hey, the front end is slowing down, but the back end is still fast. There's different ways to slice and dice, even if you didn't have a diagnostics tool.
And by the way, make sure you use a index-supported query for that and the same query every single time.
You use the same query that the app is using so that you can compare them. Let's get into that. So, the one thing I was going to say is keep in mind that just because you're monitoring the physical resources, there could be other bottlenecks on other systems that are actually messing with your response times. And network on the client is probably the biggest one nowadays, I think. Right, Howard?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just going to say network becomes such a variable, and although I don't know if it may or may not be this case in what Voss is doing, but if his load generator or controller are in different subnets, maybe different buildings even, that's where network could certainly come into play. What's going on the wire? Was bandwidth a problem, especially if they're going from one building to another? That certainly cause a lot of issues, and people don't even, I'm on the same campus. What's the difference? Well, unfortunately, you can still be on the same campus and have different network connections from building to building.
And this is the rant that opens up for me, is just people who don't know end up in PM positions or director positions or decision maker positions, and they don't know anything about all of what makes a big difference in this kind of stuff. They just say, oh, well, we'll get Vasu. He'll do that LoadRunner thing. And they throw a tool at him. And Vasu's like, yeah, I can use LoadRunner. But all of the prerequisite, things you would go through. What is the environment like? How are we connected? What's the architecture? All of these basic foundation things that you're going to ask before you get testing. How isolated is the environment? Is my traffic alone? Do I have a test schedule? All of those things. Oh, well, we don't have time to go through those pesky details, Howard. We're just going to let Vasu. Here, you've got that LoadRunner thing. LoadRunner's going to make the world perfect. You just use that LoadRunner thing and do your LoadRunner thing, Vasu, and everything's going to be great.
So, Mark, I'm kind of grinning on this one, right? My big thing was you need to have an architect, right? So if you don't have an architect, we need to think like architect. Every performance engineer out there needs to think like an architect, whether they have one or not. So I think, it's worthwhile to go back to some past episodes to, learn what does it mean to really be a performance engineering architect, and what do I have to pay attention to? Because, Mark, you're hitting the nail right on the head, right? Because we don't understand the full architecture. Without understanding that, you don't know what your variables can be.
Yeah, and that variability is maybe not Vasu's fault. So, Vasu, we want to make sure that you get some knowledge from this episode so that you can go back to the PM, the product owner, the developer, and say, hey, you guys told me I should just do my tests in dev from my laptop over Wi-Fi? Yeah, that's not a good idea. In fact, never run load over your freaking Wi-Fi. Get a load generator and put it in the lab.
So there's
sorry, it was a total rant there.
I'm going to disagree with that part, running your load generator out in the cloud, but
no, the cloud is different.
Yeah, cloud is different.
This is like in the office Wi-Fi where Mary sitting right next to you is watching a YouTube viral video.
I gotcha.
of cats.
Of cats.
Yeah. I want to add one additional item that we're seeing more and more of. That is the use of third-party service stubs.
Sure.
whether it's a e-commerce provider, whether it's a loan processor,
financing,
but there's some sort of functional stub that's sitting out there provided by a third party, and they're usually sized for functional testing purposes.
Yeah.
And they're being included in performance tests, and their performance is extremely erratic.
Yeah.
So if you have this external dependency on a service which is probably not built for scale with any sort of service level agreement like it is in production,
Yeah.
you're going to get this high variability even if you have a completely perfect infrastructure and the remainder of your test.
So you're saying that's going to happen if you're using some sort of service virtualization tool, or you think that service, or you saying
I'm saying, let's say you have a credit card provider and you're using their functional testing interface. So they say, oh, yeah, you can include it in your performance test.
Yeah, the sandbox environment sometimes. Yeah, it's actually over the wire, yeah.
Yeah, because they're going to charge you a boatload of money for all your queries. And that particular service has not been designed for scale.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
In the terms and conditions, Vasu is using load runner, and in the terms and conditions, I think there's still in the EULA, there's a thing about not using the load runner product inside a nuclear facility of any kind. I believe it's still in the fine print that you're not allowed to install at any way, shape, or form the load runner products inside a nuclear operation or management facility whatsoever. And the reason that is,
I thought that was on the GPL too.
well, I know it was in the load runner.
Would that be in the reactor chamber itself?
No, actually, the point I'm trying to make is that regardless of the tool you're using, a load generator is a loaded weapon. It's a loaded weapon with rounds, an endless number of electronic packet-driven rounds that if you don't know where that traffic is going, and suddenly, Vasu, you fire up 400 virtual users at the sandbox environment at American Express, suddenly you created 450,000 accounts within their test system, and the worse yet, you start taking down other systems, because if Vasu's complaining that his stuff is getting throttled, what kind of damage is Vasu doing with load runner to the functional testers or the integration testers or the devs or the user acceptance tests?
Meanwhile, people in London are not able to do anything on their computers and have to go to lunch early.
Exactly. Because Vasu started blowing up TSYS halfway around the world. But that's the idea. So if you don't, I think the biggest root thing here that I'm going after is this shared environments. Whether it's a virtualized load generator with variability, I think there's much bigger competition going on for resources. And Vasu's little test here is ending up being the victim of all of this stuff. And then maybe they're throttling him too. Who knows?
I've certainly been tested in enough large environments to know, and actually have been burnt myself, because changes are happening in the environment and we're not informed of what's going on, right?
Yeah. So this is our no vote against shared environments, or at least, as you point out, James, initial conditions and in-test conditions being influenced by sharing of resources across the architecture.
And if you can control for those in your test design, which we'll take a look at a little bit later, you can actually test in those environments, but you need to be aware going in of this high variability.
Yeah, how you're going to control it. Let's take a little word from our sponsor, and then we'll come back and dig a little bit into the scientific method.
Yeah.
Does that sound good?
Love it.
Oh, you guys are such geeks.
And damn proud of it, my friend.
Hosting for PerfBytes has been provided by NUCO, New Centers of Excellence in Performance Engineering, The Script Farm, LoadRunner by the Hour, Cloud Architect, Videratech, and LightSquare. For more information, visit the website www.newcoe.com or call 888-212-1104.
Welcome back, everyone. So now we're going to kind of break down a little bit more of this problem. We've alluded to kind of test design and other elements. So I think it's worthwhile to come back to this concept of reproducibility within the context of the scientific method. And, everyone thinks, ooh, scientific method, newfangled, that's new math, 1 + 1 = 3 for large values of 1. No. This is really old stuff. This goes back to those old Greek people, Aristotle, people like that.
Aristotle, is that the Kardashians? Aren't they Greek?
No, they're from next door.
Like Aristotle Onassis?
Aristotle Onassis, right? Wasn't it?
He owned a shipping company though.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Socrates. Wasn't Socrates the monkey?
I thought it was Socrates. Oh no, that's
Socrates.
That was
yeah.
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
That was the most excellent adventure.
That's
I
right.
tell you.
Do you remember the band
Right, anyway.
Human Sexual Response?
No.
No, the song "I Want to Be Like Jackie Onassis."
I want to be like Jackie Onassis. There you go. Yeah.
I want to hide behind big sunglasses.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, back to our serious subject of reproducibility, which does not require hormonal injections whatsoever.
No, it does not. So,
James, why are we talking about the scientific method? Because Vasu's part of this sexy, new, hip, agile, we don't do scientific, rigorous requirements. We do exploratory this and continuous that. We don't have the scientific method. We do something different, right?
okay, so it all boils down to confidence in your test results.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have a test that at its core produces the same result for the same inputs, so I have the same initial conditions, I have the same test data, I have the same steps to reproduce, I have the same expected results, and in the end, I actually get substantially similar output. And when I say substantially similar, I'm not saying identical because, electrons being what they are and free radicals, they'll do something slightly different every time.
Right.
And then you'll have some subtle influences from even within your environment. But you should get substantially similar behavior for common inputs. On an individual basis, you should get almost identical behavior. But once you add 500 or 5,000 or 50,000 users, you get some fuzziness. But where you're going to see it is you're going to see similar clustering in the form of standard deviation around a common point.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to see mins and maxes pretty close, if not identical, for a given range. Your average might be off a little bit one way or the other. You're going to have some commonality in the number of passed samples and failed samples within a very, very narrow range.
Yep.
But so if you get some wild variability in this, what this generally tells us is that we are lacking confidence in our output. So when we're making a decision on those test results, is it good or is it bad? We don't have enough information as a qualifier, and our risk is actually substantially increased as a result of
So,
that.
James, correct me if I'm wrong. If these people don't consider, if they really want to consider in Vasu's situation that he's running a test, obviously he's investing in building, constructing, and running a test to create a value, a result. That result is used in making a decision. Let's assume Vasu is part of a release decision, and maybe it's very frequently. Maybe it's, let's say it's every 2 weeks this software is getting released. And if Vasu's test results are all over the map because it can't be accurately or consistently reproduced, they're basically, not only are they throwing Vasu's time away, which is unfortunate, they're really could be making boldly incorrect decisions. And let's say that same company is looking at automating continuous testing so that these decisions would just be automatically calculated by a computer. Wouldn't a computer be able to say, wow, this number can't even extrapolate that from the previous result. Aren't the continuous tools just smart enough to say this is a total outlier and this your experiment failed to reproduce, so I can't make a decision?
From that point, you're playing release roulette, right?
That is release roulette, yeah.
It is. It's release roulette. You're just not able to make an educated decision. So are you going to put that software out there without anything? Let's not even software. We're talking any product, any project. Are you going to put it out there without really understanding what's going on? It's really irresponsible. So Getting back to the whole thing of getting inconsistent results. Yeah. And I think you need to step back and figure out what you're going to do to get the consistent results before you even determine whether you're going to put you're going to put that whatever you're out into the public. What if that was your I always like to use this one. What if you were on the airplane and the navigational equipment was tested like this with all those variables, would you want to get on that airplane?
I wouldn't believe the dials. I mean, like these things. What are they? The idea of calibration is you have a baseline. It is a scientific method to calibrate an instrument, a fine instrument, one might say.
So, Mark, there's something that I want to do is I want to boil it back to this concept of inconsistency, and show how it impacts the developer at risk. So let's say I run a test in a highly volatile environment, and I get the ugly baby result.
Yes.
I mean, the baby is just not ugly. He's got horns coming out of him. He's green in color, and he's blowing fire out of both ends.
Smells bad.
Yeah. I mean, it's an ugly, ugly baby.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you take those results, and you're going to start chasing down errors. Well, lacking another sample, which might be executed in a condition which is a lot cleaner.
Yep.
And might produce a really attractive baby, as an example.
Yes.
Okay, so now I have an ugly baby, and now I have an attractive baby. Which is the consistent result?
Consistently ugly?
Or is it consistently attractive? We don't know.
You don't. Yeah, you can't. And that's what I have a problem with these sort of even on our own. I don't want to contradict ourselves, because in many good test conditions, you can do repeated continuous trending as long as you have some controls and consistent controls over the conditions of the test. But a lot of people are like, well, the response time should be the same or better. It can't be worse. I mean, these vagaries, these nuanced things, it's just drive me nuts.
Sure, it can be worse if you don't understand what the hell you're doing.
Yeah, or it's a false result. So, even though you say it's worse, it's actually better because you don't know what the baseline is in the first place.
Well, wouldn't that be So one thing I always like to do, Mark, in situations like this is I like to kind of, talk about controls. And this really gets into some good performance testing basics, right?
Yeah.
What's to me, the absolute bottom, rawest thing you can do is a single user performance test, right?
Right.
Why not prove consistency with a single user test before moving on, right?
Yeah. So like a canary script, a canary in the coal mine kind of script. Yeah.
Exactly.
So guys, what I like to do is always have one deliberately underloaded load generator. So it's the same configuration as all the others, even if it's a virtual machine load generator, but it has a single virtual user of each type on it.
Yeah.
So that gives me a control group within the test that I can at least look for consistency within that group.
Yeah.
Even better still, if I want a measure of consistency within the test and is the test environment healthy, I might actually have a control application.
Sure.
Like, say, the HP flights application, and I have one user running against that as well, also on my control generator. So
sort of a slice of the architecture that's just one component in a line.
Yeah, and I know the scalability of flights for one user at all times. So if it starts varying, I know I've got a pretty severe environment problem.
Yeah.
Not necessarily anything related to the app, because it has known scalability and it's got known performance. So
let's go back to that for a minute, all right? Because you bring up a great point with that. And, what I'd like to add on to that, too, is how, in Vaso, I apologize, I don't know how you're doing this or if you're even doing this. And you maybe have just one load generator at your disposal, but, what type of test calibration are you doing?
Yeah.
How many, you're running this series of business processes, so on and so forth. What have you actually physically calibrated the test to see what your load generator can take? Or are you just randomly pumping more, having the load generator pump more traffic through?
Yeah. But, we'll come back actually in part 3 and talk a little bit more about our tips and suggestions, because we're just brimming with ideas to help Vasu. James, you bring up the point of reproducibility because it's essential in the scientific method, and I think about the scientist in the lab who maybe discovered the cure for cancer, right?
Yes.
And oh my God, there it was, this experiment. It was 47 steps in the procedure, and then you combine part A with part B, and poof, there's the smoke, and boom, there's the cure for cancer. And they say, all right, under peer review now.
Cold fusion,
Reproduce it. And suddenly you go through all the exact same steps and you think everything is exactly the same thing and you're running the same load runner script and the same whatever, and suddenly, boom, you can't cure cancer. And for the next 3 years, you're hammering your head at the desk, what am I missing? What am I missing? What am I missing? And this is why reproducibility is essential if the decision you're making at the end of the release is we absolutely have to handle 1,000 hits per second on a single web server to support the load in the UK for the ticket site that's not going to crash. And you're sitting there basically saying, I can't get it. If there's one, the Super Bowl, if it's one major business decision based on that one test you're doing, Vasu, then it's worth it to escalate to your management, go back and tell them, I need to have an isolated window of time to run these tests and get this consistent because this decision is really important. Vasu, if it's a throwaway release and you know what, hey, if it's broken, we'll fix it next week and the pressure's really not that heavy, I got to say, you might just make some people aware that your numbers are going to be a little plus or minus 20%, but we're going to find some bugs and do the best we can. You might be in that situation too. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not as rigorous as some situations, which we feel are actually really important. And you know what? If everyone felt as strongly as we did and rigorous about these measurements, then no one would ever be on the news of the damned. But Vasu, we don't want you to end up on the news of the damned, my friend.
And I think we need to give Vasu some credit. It's simply in recognition, hey, this is a problem. I know it's a problem at my core.
Yeah.
As a computer scientist or engineer or a tester, this bothers me. And I need to find a way to reconcile it. There are a lot of people who see it and don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah. And you know what? Testing is about making a little bit of noise for the forces of good. You're trying to be proactive. If some people get their nose out of joint, you apologize and say, hey, I'm really sorry. This is not personal. It's not about you. But you know what? You can't go running this stuff on the database in the middle of my test. I'm taking an actual measurement that's really important. And you're just noise. You're putting noise in the system. You can't do that.
Just think about it. Again, if somebody was finding the cure for cancer, you wouldn't let another doctor sit there and squirt stuff into your solution while you're building the formula, would you?
Yeah, you walk in and put his cigarette out in the green formula and the other.
That was the missing thing, the missing controlled element.
Well, you want to get
it was the tobacco ash.
It's actually pretty funny. I saw a movie a long time ago with Sean Connery called Medicine Man when he was in South America. He was trying to find a cure for cancer. And you know what the variable was that they couldn't figure out? It was, talk about bugs, it was the ants in the sugar bowl that helped them find that was the whole catalyst for the cure for cancer.
Exactly.
Oh, that's too funny.
Yeah, so that is exactly the same rigor with which somebody would look at Vasu and say, hey, your numbers, we're trying to make decisions off this, and if Vasu, if the pressure's on you, if you can't make these numbers work out, then we're just going to get rid of you and replace you because, Vasu, you don't know what you're doing. The truth is, they should look in the mirror and say, well, I know we told business that we could save $5 million by testing in one shared system. I think I think you're increasing
your risk by $5 million or a significant percentage of it by doing that.
Yeah, by basically eliminating the value of all testing by doing that, you open yourself up to a defect which has nothing to do with your expenses. The defect could cause a massive outage. You end up on the news of the damned. You're out of business. Your partners won't invest in you. People sell your stock price plummets. I mean, one bug that Vasu finds is worth the $2 million to set up a 50% lab or even get your act together and start testing in production and figure that out.
Or Mark, there's even some very good commercial labs that will reproduce hardware for a short time for a price.
Yeah.
So you don't have to buy it, but you're going to pay. You're still going to pay a price for it.
Yeah. So unfortunately, a lot of us in the engineering world, we don't spend time putting together the ROI statement that says, hey, here's why it's important for me to have an isolated environment, that I can take performance measurements that are time-based. They're not functional pass-fail, black and white. They are nuanced, to bring the word back. And Vasu's definitely in that situation. So, guys, it's really important that we give other shout-outs and important sharing, learning opportunities in the form of a PerfBytes public service announcement. I think it's important that we pause things now to take a little moment for it.
You know them. You see them hit the end of an iteration and they just plain ran out of time for performance testing. You hear them convincing the VP of development to just fire all the testers. You see some other kids aren't testing at all. And you see the cool kids, well, they're testing in prod. It can be tough under all that peer pressure just because you want to be cool too. But being cool isn't as important as it seems. PerfBytes encourages you to keep your own commitment to quality steadfast and not give in to those trendy, cool hipsters who don't know how to test and who, by the way, don't pay for what happens in prod. Stand your ground against emergency promotions and too fast releases directly to production without any testing whatsoever. Know that PerfBytes supports you because friends don't let friends deploy without testing.
It always brings a tear to my eyes, James.
Me too.
It does to me too, Howard.
Doesn't it? So moving. So heartfelt. All right, so let's review some of these things, try to encapsulate some of the advice that we have for Vasu. And I think of the ones that we have listed here to try to help him out, I think the biggest one we stumbled on, even at different points, the three of us, is this idea of isolating his environment. And there's a couple different ways that he might consider doing that. Well, the one I wrote down, which is probably the easiest, is testing. Actually, James, you wrote this. Testing off hours. So you don't have to change anything. You don't have to buy new hardware. The one thing you might say is, hey, everybody, from midnight to 3 a.m., everyone else is off the test systems. No tests, no automation, no builds, no goofy late night, whatever. But give Vasu all the systems quiet, isolated, do your performance tests in the middle of the night. And I can remember I worked at a startup, small company, and that was how it worked, right? During the day, the databases were used for functional testing, integration testing, development. At 8 p.m., everyone else wanted to go leave or play Doom or something like that. And they got off the systems and they isolated the database that I was testing on for that 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. So Vasu, even though it's not a pretty solution, at least for a while, you could do 10 days or do a sprint worth of off-hours testing. If you're located in a different location from your customer, that may work as well. Maybe you're already in India or you're in a different location. So you might be testing with the time zones to your advantage. But just testing and be very overt. Set up a schedule. Put up a Jira calendar. Put up a shared Outlook calendar. And start scheduling the time to say, this is when this test is going to run. And if you find anyone else on the system, you call up their manager and you say, get off the system. Functional testing, those guys usually can test at the same time, not a big deal. And there's all that can be done.
Well, unless they're running some odd queries or changing your data.
Yeah, don't step on your own data, but that's different than taking a time-based measurement, a temporal measurement.
I like the off hours idea, Mark. I mean, me the production testing guy. That's when we do all our testing. Our tests don't start till midnight.
Yeah.
So we're used to that, right? And that, believe it or not, you say we're testing in prod. We can kind of control what's happening in production by testing on those off hours. So got a lot more control than you think.
Yeah, and I think it's also the least amount of imposition to the process or to tools or other you're not really, because he's going to have a lot of battles in these shared environments. It could be, I want my own database server, I want my own hardware, I want my own network. He's going to be fighting upstream against a lot of those decisions. And the easiest one to say is, all right, don't change any of that, but you know what? From midnight to 3 a.m., I want the system all to myself just to run load tests.
And ask for dinner too.
Yeah, say, hey, I'll work the swing shift if you throw in, some beer. Now, there's a couple caveats with that, too. Sometimes you won't have anyone to collaborate with if you find problems, so you really have to plan it ahead of time. So you might not do it every night.
Well, that's actually a really interesting point, the collaboration piece, right? So when I've been most of my load testing career testing enterprise-wide applications, we do have that collaboration of different forces, so to speak, on the test, everyone monitoring their piece,
Yeah.
right? And we're running those tests at 8 p.m., so we didn't even have to go to midnight. These are definitely in a performance testing environment or an internal environment, but
So
we
Howard,
had everybody online.
So, Howard,
Yeah.
I think that's very labor intensive. That's the ideal. You have someone watching their platform and they can say, hey, dues of widgets are up 30%. Let's stop the test. But all of these tools that are on the market, whether they're open source or commercial, have the ability to monitor and collect system metrics. So if you can capture that expertise or that knowledge base from that platform owner, what do you look at during the test, and turn that into a monitor, then you free up that labor component even during live production hours where you're not pulling them during a test. And certainly during off hours, you can collect all the data and they can look at it the following morning.
Yeah, that could work.
Yeah, a lot of people like to do, and I'm a proponent of this. I've done this several times. A lot of us like to do testing and tuning in real time, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I like to have the army, so to speak, don't care about the cost, would rather have everyone there to do the testing and tuning live on film versus having to wait till tomorrow to do it.
Here's my advice to Vasu, though, is that even if you do a couple of sprints worth of late night, isolated, all by yourself in the lab type testing, if your results start to become more consistent and more believable and more credible, and you do what James says, you reach out and say, hey, can you tell me what are the things you monitor? What code are you looking at? Do you have a profiler you use? And start, you'll kind of have some freedom, hopefully, in the middle of the night where you're like, I can set these things up and I can monitor this. After a couple of sprints, when your results start to become more solid and more reliable, and you can start telling more of a story around the analysis and the extrapolation and the decisions, you might go back to those people in development or database or network and say, hey guys, I'm seeing this interesting trend, and they'll say, well, when do you run your test? So I run my test at midnight. That's ridiculous. You be funny. All of a sudden the database guy says, why you run your test at midnight? And Vasu, you'll sell them, well, that's the only time that I can find the database is totally isolated to take my measurements. And then your new friend, the database person, will say, oh, that's ridiculous, Vasu. I have this machine right over here that's not being used, and you can use it. So that's where making friends and the collaboration may come second, but you might have to make some sacrifices, put some skin in the game, or in the middle of the night, start getting it and say, look, tell that story. Hey, this is the only time I can get an isolated system to do the test. And if it's a valuable result, you take it back to those individuals, and then somebody will boil it up to a PM or a director or the bean counter and say, why the heck did you guys tell Vasu that he couldn't have his own system? This is ridiculous. And I'm not getting up at midnight to come in here and do some query tuning or whatever. We're setting up a lab for that guy. So that's where we're headed. That's where we want to, hopefully, get Vasu pointed to. But Howard, what's another idea for suggesting ways to deal with this reproducibility and variability that Vasu sees?
Well, I always like to, if I'm seeing anything really weird going on, I always like to start looking through the fucking log files, my friend. Because, boy, there's just a wealth of information just sitting there, and you can see all sorts of funky things going on by doing that. I think it just becomes a matter of how good of an analyst can you be? How good a deep dive? Look, to me, it's basic troubleshooting 101. One thing that early in my career, before I got into the QA space and QA engineering space, I did a lot of maintainability engineering.
Yes.
Right? One of the key things of maintainability engineering is you have to do a ton of troubleshooting when you're doing maintainability engineering, right? So believe it or not, troubleshooting 101 is a huge piece to understanding how to reproduce a problem, how to research a problem, how to analyze a problem, how to set up your experiments to reproduce your problem, right? So I think, and that may be a problem in the industry today in general, that people have not really had the time or whatever, the opportunity to do something like that.
Yeah,
right?
it can be a permissions and access issue. But you bring up a really good point, Howard, because I think the simplest thing that Vasu might look at is just, let's say you tail the log file when you're not running Load Runner and you see tons of activity on the system. You're like, I'm not running load. Who else is on this system?
And unfortunately, those IP addresses go back to particular hosts, so you can go knock on their door.
They say, why are you in this system? I'm supposed to be testing. In fact, that's a good thing to monitor. You can do the log monitor in Sitescope. He has a free copy of Sitescope. You can do the log monitor and start looking at who has access. In the middle of your test, who's accessing the database? You could look at $V session in Oracle.
I know that Ben Simo and I both love Splunk for this very reason.
Splunk is perfect.
We can take a look at response times coming through particular IP addresses. So, if you have 5 load generators, you can see that 3 are high and 2 are low. And it's like, hey, what's going on here? Yeah. You can look at trends across date ranges. So if you're running a test every day, you can see if tests are going up or down or from test to test across hours. So it's a really, if you don't have Splunk, it's a good tool. Mm-hmm. There are other solutions out there, but they're not as good as Splunk. Get Splunked.
Yeah. So James, you mentioned, I think, another one here, which is rebooting everything to control that initial condition, make sure the scheduler in the Load Runner controller is using the same. So really rebooting everything, I think.
Yeah. So it takes us all to the same initial condition. So I prefer a hard boot. So you power cycle the machines, you bring everything up from zero. And so they're all at the same initial conditions. When you go through your ramp up is consistent. It's exercising all the code, so it's all compiled. And then you're going to get to your time under full load, this 1 hour window or 30 minutes or whatever that you're using for time under full load. And then that's going to be the period that you take your samples from. So controlling those initial conditions. And by the way, that also goes to the data in the database.
Yeah.
Take a snapshot, restore it. You might have to rebuild indexes if depending upon how you're doing it, if you're just restoring by table, drop and rebuild the indexes real quick. But having that consistent initial condition takes a lot of variables out of play. So if you have, for instance, a degrading response time over volume of data, you're using the same database and data keeps growing day in and day out, and you have a missing index on a particular table that's a core query, that could be a root issue right there.
Yeah. I think that sounds pretty good. I think the other thing we talked about being able to test, off hours is also some way of letting everyone else know in the company or in your team that you are running a test and when you're going to be running it. So starting some communication plan. It could be an email. It could be a Jira ticket. It could be that you get on their calendar. That's a great thing because people hate seeing invites. And so they'll see it blocked out, invite the entire company to the 4-hour window of your load test and just see what kind of attention you can get. And here's a hint. Put your test objectives in the body of the invite in Outlook so people can see what is that guy, what's the objectives of that test? What is that guy learning? Oh my gosh, I'm interested in that. You might find some people who want to get into doing testing.
Another thing, Mark, too, and this is kind of building on what James said just a few minutes ago, after you do all your rebooting and reimaging and everything else, lock the environment down so no one can go do anything in it while you're testing.
Sure. And that could be something like you instantiate a username and password, a front end on the page. All of a sudden you start enforcing simple authentication. On the database, you might stop shell access. You might stop database access. You might turn everyone in the database into or just delete their entry. Because if you're going to flash back the database or roll back restore, everyone's going to get their access back at the end of the night when you're done testing anyway. So why not boot all their accounts out and just have you and the app accounts and the Oracle system accounts? And
of course, when you cycle the database, either soft booted or hard booted, all their sessions are going to die anyway. So if they have some sort of automated session running, hey, I left and I'm doing a bulk copy, that I don't want to sit around and watch.
Yeah.
Well, that session's going to die.
Yep. And they shouldn't be doing a bulk copy test in the middle of your load test anyway, Vasu.
No, they shouldn't, because that's going to screw everything up. So here's another thing, guys, that I used to do when I was the builder of giant labs in some of my past life, I would actually set up a series of switches so I could cut the lab off from the rest of the world. So even in a shared environment, I could chunk my section off and then just kind of physically turn off access to anybody else.
Yeah, and it could be that Vasu doesn't have network permissions through security nowadays. It could be, yeah.
If he does, that would be something he could look into doing.
Sure, or just make friends with the network guys. Make friends with them and say, I think overall, the biggest advice just sort of generally to Vasu is, Vasu, if you're not telling your colleagues and your management, hey, guys, load testing is disruptive to every other activity that you're trying to do. If we're in a shared environment, I'm going to blow you guys up. So, watch, here, run load runner, no think time, 50 virtual users, and blow the system up, even from your laptop. I mean, just say, do you want me to be doing this in the middle of your functional test, your integration test, your development, your whatever, and start basically blowing the system up and have them deal with you, make them deal with you as a disruptor, and don't believe them when they say, "Oh, Vasu, can you just do your performance thing and run less load?"
Actually, if you're going to do that, make sure it's a very senior boss and have them push the go button.
Yeah.
Because if the senior IT administrator's favorite application just got machine gunned to death in production, you want someone else's finger on that go button.
Yeah. But at least, yes, communicate that this is disruptive. That's why we need isolation. And really, more importantly than disruption, is you are taking time-based measurements and resource-based measurements that are sensitive to other activities. We're trying to simulate production, not crazy test noise in the middle of everything I'm doing. So yeah, I think that's a big thing. The couple other pointers for Vasu, if he's not doing simulators, if he's not using service virtualization, or if he's, like you mentioned, James, before, if you're actually connecting the performance system to a third-party provider, a sandbox, try to put some simulators in there so you can isolate those external dependencies and virtualize those parts like an external data system or web service so that they're not variable. Make them constant. Make them respond. So I'm working at a gig right now. They have a marvelous simulator strategy. It's not consistent. It's not perfect. But you know what? They work, and they work quite well for isolating QA environments and load test environments and stuff like that. So that's another good
And
thing.
what you can do with a lot of your virtualization tools is you can actually program latency into it too.
Sure, but you could put in a consistent 50 milliseconds or 20
Exactly.
milliseconds.
Yeah, what is the maximum of your SLA from this service?
And just remember, when you're testing, you are running an experiment, and you need to control the situation. And I know I mentioned it earlier in part 2, but if you want to understand consistency, if you're having issues, step the way you run your test.
Yeah.
Do a single user test first.
Yeah.
Am I getting consistent results with a single user test? Awesome. Now at 5 users, and run that 3 or 4 times for consistency. Am I getting consistency there? Cool. And then step it up to X, and then find out where your breakpoint is. Mark, for all I know, Vasu could be hitting some sort of exponential point of failure and not even know it.
Not even know it if he's not doing those sort of step increases to figure out where it is working consistently. And again, I'll say, Vasu, stop testing over the Wi-Fi from your desktop in the office.
So Mark, now is a good time, I think, to go back to the control group concept.
Sure.
And if you do have multiple load generators and you have one physical reference load generator, and maybe you've got a pool of 50 virtual machine load generators, consider taking a page out of statistical quality control from manufacturing.
Yep.
That is, I'm going to look at a subset of data, and I'm going to infer the quality of the larger population from that. And so I will take my control load generator with my control sample group on it, and I will use that for decision-making purposes, knowing that the entire rest of the population is highly variable in their performance and not a good sample for looking at a representative of performance production or
Yeah.
test production
Yeah.
or test performance.
Yeah, and I think to his point, he seems to understand, at least from Load Runner, sort of the 90th percentile and some of the things that you get out of the Load Runner analysis tool. And so the idea is that understanding not just what the analysis tool spits out at you, Vasu, but really understand the whole approach to creating, as James says, these sort of subgroups, a canary script, a canary load generator, a slice of the architecture, so that you can start looking at the samples that are coming from that subset, that control group, that one load generator. And in a way, Howard, it's the same as you're saying, looking at the subset of a single virtual user, 5 virtual users, 20 virtual users in separate things, and see what the stats look like in these different groups as you proceed. And then you can sort of divide all the numbers and conquer that way.
So, Mark, I think the points that what James said and I said are basically the same thing.
No,
Point
they're not,
is-
Howard. No, they're not. No, they're not.
Yeah, they are.
Yes,
James.
they are.
Oh,
They really are.
Damn.
They really are, James.
So sad
they
for you.
really are.
Now, the last thing that we didn't recommend to Vasu, James, and you and I have seen this work in countless situations, is straight up bribery with beer, with pizza, gifts, monetary gifts, taking people out to dinner.
Companionship.
Sure. Just be, sometimes developers, especially storage administrators, they don't have friends. They're like hermits. They live underneath the sand, underneath the raised floor. Just become friends. Bring them little snacks and make friends with them. But Vasu, making friends in a way that you're sharing with them the impact of the load you're going to create and the desire and the need and the necessity of isolation in your measurements. And that's really what you're bringing to them. And then if you're going to offer something to these other friends through bribery, is to figure out what they need. Hey, I can tell you more consistently where the database is going to break, where the network is going to run over, where we're going to run out of CPU, where the bottlenecks. You can give something more consistently so that you have something to trade. And that's an important bargaining chip in that relationship. In closing, my closing thoughts are just to encourage Vasu to go back and listen to a few of our earlier episodes in PerfBytes, because we kind of touched on 3 or 4 of them here. One, of course, is performance analysis. And aside from the hilarity of the News of the Damned in the middle of Prancercise on that one, there's actually a bunch of really great tips about how to go beyond just the 90th percentile, what a standard deviation is, what a curve, min-max average, and how to make sense of analysis. Also, scalability and estimation. Performance scalability and estimation is an episode where we talk about trending. We talk about variability and how to communicate that and how to analyze that. One of our earlier, very early episodes with James and I is performance in a virtualized world, talking about virtual load generators. James, you talked a bit in that episode about control groups or a control physical load generator.
And Mark, I think it was in that show that we finally put our boxing gloves down.
Yeah, we did, because we knew we agreed more than we disagreed on the fact that it's a real problem. No matter what position we had ever come from, on how stupid it was that people do that. So pretty much I ended up agreeing with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And the last one, Vasu, is to look at performance monitoring, because you mentioned CPU and memory, but there are other things. I encourage you to look at performance monitoring also in the app layer, the operating system. Look in the app layer and operating systems for things like threads, connections, amount of heap, number of connections in a connection pool, max threads in an app server or web server, number of sessions. If there's any, look in the app layers for logical monitoring as well, not just your physical CPU, network and memory, and disk. Howard, what are your closing thoughts for Vasu, suggestions for him?
I don't want this to be pointed directly at Vasu, because I'm going to make a general statement right now. So Vasu, do not take this personally. But, I think as a whole, we need to make believe that we are real engineering professionals versus using the excuse of we're software professionals.
Yeah.
All right. And let's do some real experimentation out there. Let's make sure we understand and dissect all the variables all the time. And that will help us learn what our issues are, all right? Don't use Agile as an excuse for not doing things right. Agile, you can be an Agile shop and still do things in the proper way.
That's true. Great advice.
And for me, continuing this kind of dissection of what you need to do or what you need to look at. I'm saying always go back to your testing fundamentals when you have a test which is not performing as expected. So there's always this pressure to move forward, to set aside what are solid testing principles, whether it's functional automation or performance or even security testing, in order to hit the end date or end goal. But usually what happens in that haste is that now we have inconsistent performance and we have to go back to what did we skip in the process. So here we've got initial conditions, in-test conditions, expected results, control groups, parse out each one of those elements of the scientific method, hold it up as a magnifying glass against your test and say, okay, could we do better? What are we missing here?
Very good. Well,
right on.
That's excellent. Vasu, we wish you the best of luck. Thank you again for sending in your question to ask@perfbytes.com. And we hope we've given you some ideas at least to ponder and steps to take. And, of course, the door is open for anyone else who has a question similar to Vasu. We'd love to help you guys. Just shoot us an email at ask@perfbytes.com. Well, PerfBytes listeners, once again, you've come to the close of another slightly shorter episode of PerfBytes when compared to the prior 3 episodes, but longer than your average News of the Damned episode, so roughly on par in intolerance, of course, with normal episodes. And, of course, that means we're going to thank you about the same amount as the other times, even though it's variable. We can reproduce your listening pleasure for the show today.
As always, I just want to thank you, the lovely Mrs. Chorney, the queen bee of PerfByte cereal, for allowing me to have so much fun every other Monday night, taping with my good friends, Mark and James.
Beautiful.
Oh, thank you. So, Mom, thank you for listening, and I'm glad you had a good Mother's Day.
Yeah, happy Mother's Day to James. Everyone's mom. That would be good. I will always say thanks, of course, now to the Dr. Sexy Irish voice of PerfBytes, Martha. And yes, very good. That 4 long years is all done. And also special thanks to our great sponsors, Smart Bear and Sosta, for their sponsorship and support of the PerfBytes show and the PerfBytes community.
Mark, Howard, today's show is powered by reruns of the TV series Firefly.
And just remember, folks, all the content of this PerfBytes episode is 100% copyrighted and protected by James Grenades on board the ship Serenity. In that case, it's also protected by Frank Costanza, uttering the famous battle cry, "Serenity now! Serenity now!"
Yes. For more information about the PerfBytes, please visit the show's websites at www.perfbytes.com or follow us on the Twitter, the Tumblr, or the Facebook. And, of course, you can always subscribe and listen to the PerfBytes podcast on iTunes, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, and testingpodcast.com. Just open your favorite listening app and search for PerfBytes and click the subscribe button. And you might not know this, but you can also send us an email at ask@perfbytes.com, just like Vasu did, or even leave us a voicemail at 77-LOAD-PERF. That's 775-623-7373.
The PerfBytes show and staff are supporters of the Practical Performance Analyst, the Performance Engineering Book of Knowledge, Test Bash and the Ministry of Testing, the Computer Measurement Group, the Workshop on Performance and Reliability, and of course, the Software Test Professionals community of software testers. Of course, we always hope to see you at the next STPCon conference. Join us there for a live PerfBytes episode, great performance testing workshops, training, and of course, single malt scotch tastings.
Yes. And as always, Howard, ride 'em jackalope.
Whee! Ride 'em jackalope.
Ride 'em jackalope, baby!